everyone, and welcome. My name is Dr. Tricia Vesely, and I am visiting assistant professor of Hebrew Bible and Christian ethics at Memphis Theological Seminary. I've been speaking last week and then again this week on the subject of comfort through the lens of the biblical book of Job. The title of my 2-week series is Wisdom from Job, Giving and Receiving Comfort in Times of Suffering. This week, I'm going to start with a brief recap of what we discussed last week. I will say a bit more about words as embodied entities, and then I'll move into the question of what brought comfort to the sufferer Job, focusing especially on the divine speeches and Job's return to the community in the epilogue. As a reminder, please feel free to use the question and answer feature to ask questions at any time during the presentation, or you may use the chat feature as well. Just a note about the chat feature, there are 2 options there. If you select the second option, your posts will be able to be seen by everyone, and sometimes that's nice for the discussions. If you select the first option, which is the default option, I'll still be able to see it, but I will be the only one who will be able to see that. We'll have our time of discussion at the end, but please post questions as they arise for you at any time during the presentation. All right. Job's story of suffering will probably resonate with many of us today. This biblical figure has lost economic security, his possessions, his children are gone, his health is gone, and he is alienated from his community. While this is a book that seems to be all about suffering, I called our attention last week to the centrality of the verb comfort, or the theme of comfort that is present in this book. The specific verb to give or receive comfort is naham in Hebrew, and this forms a thematic thread that runs throughout the book, binding its various parts together. In the opening scenes, after Job's losses, 3 of his friends come with the express purpose to comfort and console him. In the middle of the book, Job critiques them for failing to comfort him, and he calls them comforters of trouble. And after Job's encounter with God, and in the epilogue, the verb naham is used as well. So Job appears to have received comfort by the end of the book, and his quest for comfort comes full circle. Last week, we focused on the relationship between Job and his friends, and the first 2 occurrences of this verb. We explored the question why Job's friends failed in their attempts to comfort Job, and I argued that more than right words or intellectual agreement, Job was seeking genuine relationality. He beseeches his friends for solidarity, or hesed in Hebrew, hospitality, and courageous compassion. A demonstration of these gifts would show the friends' value from their perspective to Job. Unfortunately, however, the friends continue to treat Job like a proposition rather than a person. They refuse to engage in a face-to-face encounter with him. Job calls them out for their fear, which keeps them at arm's length, and their unwillingness to acknowledge and accept him as he is, an innocent sufferer. So I'd like to start this week by returning to the idea of the significance of words and what constitutes a right word or a wise word in the book of Job. As I noted last week, the book of Job is generally classified as a wisdom book, and the concept of word and wisdom are 2 very important concepts in the Bible. But we need to think about these concepts differently in the Hebrew Bible than we sometimes do in the modern world. Last week, I remarked that readers often assess Job and his friends' speeches based on their content, but that Job's responses reflect his desire for something more than intellectual assent or an agreement about doctrine. Words and wisdom are embodied realities for the biblical writers, and they cannot be divorced from the incarnational or embodied reality behind them, which is the speaker. It's interesting that in the Hebrew Bible, words are often depicted as physical entities. They can fill up a space, they can have substance, and they can be powerful instruments that affect the world around them. We see this most vividly, of course, in the creation account of Genesis 1, where it's the word of God that changes chaos into creation. The physicality of a word in the Hebrew Bible is evident in the very term itself, davar. This term in Hebrew is used not just for word, but it also means something like thing, event, or matter. So a davar in Hebrew is an entity. Both Job and his friends share the expectation that wise words ought to have substance. And this is reflected in their critiques against one another. Words that fail have no weight, according to Job and his friends. So we see that following Zophar's counsel, that if Job directs his heart and his hands towards God and removes any iniquity with him, then he will find favor with God. Job responds with this: My eye has seen all this, my ear has heard it and understood it. But you invent lies. All of you are worthless physicians. If you would only keep quiet, it would be considered wisdom on your part. And he continues, your maxims are proverbs of ashes. Your responses are defenses of dust. The friends, in turn, claim that Job's speech is nothing but wind. Eliphaz warns Job in chapter 15, should the wise answer with windy knowledge and fill themselves with the east wind? Should they argue in words that can do no good? And in response to Eliphaz, and after Job critiques his friends for being comforters of trouble, Job describes their counsel as windy words. I have heard many such things. Comforters of trouble are you all. Have windy words no limit? What provokes you that you keep on talking, he says. In somewhat of a summary of their attempts to comfort him, Job says this: why do you comfort me, Naham, with empty nothings, Hevel? Of your replies, only treachery remains. This verse in chapter 21 contains another use of the verb naham, and once again contains a critique by Job of his friends' attempts to comfort him. Their comfort, Job says, amounts to hevel. The word hevel that Job uses here is also an important concept in the Hebrew Bible. It's Kohelet or Ecclesiastes' repeated refrain, often translated as vanity. Vanity of vanities, says the teacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And this is the word hevel used over and over again. This term hevel means something like vapor, breath, futility, emptiness, or something that is transitory or ethereal. And interestingly, it's also the proper name Abel, whose life was but a breath or fleeting. So Job is telling his friends that their responses, their words of comfort, are like an ethereal vapor that disappears into thin air a few seconds after it is released. Their words have no weight, no lasting value. For Job, there can be no meaningful conversation, no wise counsel without a relationship of facing. Without this, words are like an insubstantial vapor. Last week, we talked about this in connection with Job's plea that his friends face him. Job's first response to his friends after Eliphaz speaks is not to debate Eliphaz's theology. Instead, he continues to express his pain. He tells his friends that he longs for chesed. He critiques them for fleeing in fear from the horror that he represents to them. And then he beseeches them to face him, to enter into his space, and to apprehend him as a tangible presence. Face me, for I will not lie to your faces. Relent, let there not be an injustice. Relent, I may yet receive justice, he says. If his friends can face him, enter his space, then they will truly understand his situation. The truth will be clear, he says. And I argued last week that Job is seeking what Jewish philosopher Emanuel Levinas calls a genuine face-to-face encounter, or what Bonhoeffer calls being incarnationally present to another. So I'll repeat this important notion that in the Hebrew Bible, the concepts of wisdom and word are embodied realities. They must be lived out in our daily lives and in genuine encounters with others and with God. For the sufferer Job, being able to relate to him in such a way is an ethical matter. And there's a bit of a warning in his words here. The friend's refusal to acknowledge Job as he is, as a real, tangible human being, may cause them to commit an injustice, he says. It's interesting that the word translated relent here also has very strong physical underpinnings in Hebrew. It literally means to change direction or to turn around, and it's the verb shuv. As an aside, this is the word that is used throughout the prophetic books, which is often translated as repent. So the concept of repentance in Hebrew is not just an internal feeling sorry before God, for example. It's connected with a very physical aspect of one's being. One must change one's path, walk in a different direction. And with this imperative, Job is again asking that his friends change their physical stance with respect to him. So words are important in the book of Job, but not in the way that we might think of wise or true words, in the sense of whether or not they accurately describe a world out there. In Job, wise or effective words, words that bring comfort and that can change a person's situation, must be spoken from a context of being incarnationally present in the world and entering into the space of those around us. The words of those who live out their lives in such a manner can have power and transformational value. Job's friends' words cannot bring to fruition what they purport to do, if their purpose was indeed to comfort and console Job, because they won't enter his space. Their responses do not transform Job's state of suffering. And so their words fall upon Job as empty wind, or as nothing, as he says in 6:21. I'm going to jump ahead to the epilogue now to make a few comments about God's response to the friends before we return to God's encounter with Job in chapters 38 through 41. We noted last week that the friends say a lot of things that sound right, things that we find elsewhere in the Bible, and things that we might even find ourselves saying at times. They extol God's marvelous works of creation. They claim that God is a just God who does not let the wicked go unpunished, and they marvel at God's inscrutable ways. And many of their statements seem like sound theological statements. And yet, God critiques them in the epilogue, and God's response is interesting. In chapter 42:7, God addresses Eliphaz and says this: I am angry with you and your two friends because you have not spoken truthfully to me, as did my servant Job. Many translations read this as you have not spoken truthfully about me, as did Job. But the preposition about is not the preposition that is used in this Hebrew text. The preposition that is used is to, the directional preposition, and it's different than the word one would use if one wanted to say something like about. So the text literally says, I am angry with you because you have not spoken truthfully to me, as has my servant Job. And the word truthfully is a word whose root meaning is to be secure, firm, or stable. So the point of God's words here may be something like, you have not spoken words that have substance or strength to me. You have not entered into a genuine relationship or a genuine relation with me, as has my servant Job. Perhaps the friends were too busy constructing right dogma to enter into a genuine face-to-face relationship with God also, as they neglected to do with Job. And as pained and as angry as Job's words were, he does address God directly, and he seeks an encounter with God throughout his speeches. Biblical scholar Ellen Davis writes, in fact, the companions do say some things that sound like good theology. We even read excerpts from their speeches from time to time in church and call it the word of the Lord. Yet the final divine judgment on them is that they are totally off base because they are trying to talk about God without engaging in the fearsome, always potentially disorienting business of talking directly to God. Their words can only bloom like cut flowers. When God speaks out of the whirlwind, they all blow away. Perhaps because Job does not find comfort when he turns to his friends, he is all the more motivated to renew his efforts to find God. In chapter 23, for example, we read, would that I knew how to reach him, speaking of God, how to get to his dwelling place. But if I go east, he is not there. If west, I still cannot perceive him. North, but he is concealed, and I do not behold him. South, he is hidden. I cannot see him. Finally, God does appear to Job, marking the longest theophany or appearance of God found in the Hebrew Bible, spanning 4 chapters. After this remarkable storm theophany and Job's cosmic tour, we find another use of the verb naham. In 42, 5 and 6, Job says to God, I had heard of you with my ears, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I relent, and I am comforted on dust and ashes. In his response, Job uses this verb naham to give or receive comfort, and the theme we've been tracing so far in the book. This term, naham, essentially means to evoke a change in one's stance or in one's perspective or in one's posture with regard to something. It is used of God in Genesis 6, for example, when God decides to send a flood to undo creation. God sees the wickedness of humanity and God nahams. There it is often translated as God was sorry or God regretted that God had made humankind. The essence is that God changes God's stance with respect to creation, and so decides to send a flood to undo creation so that God might begin again. We find this verb in 1 Samuel 15:11 as well, when God tells Samuel that God is sorry, naham, that God made Saul king. And later in that chapter, Samuel tells Saul that God is going to end his kingship and give it to another. Essentially, God is changing God's course of action with respect to Saul's kingship. We see the verb used in the sense of finding comfort in Genesis 24. With Isaac's marriage of Rebekah, we read that Isaac loved her, and thus he found comfort, naham, after his mother Sarah's death. And in Ruth thanks Boaz for comforting her after allowing her to find food and water. In all of these cases, the basic meaning is to incur a change in one's state of being. Usually in Job, this term is translated as repent. so that the changed stance of Job would be one from professing innocence to an acknowledgement of his guilt. I pointed out, though, the term that is usually used for repent in the Hebrew Bible, shuv, is not the word that is used here. I don't want to argue for the rightness or wrongness of translations in Job, but I simply want to suggest that Nahum here carries the theme of comfort from the opening of the book to its close. And there's something of that that can be read in Job's answer to God. We can say that God's appearance changes Job's stance and brings him out of his suffering and back into human community again. It reorients Job to life again. And once God's words are ended, Job's laments cease. He's surrounded by his kin and new friends, and he starts a new family. All of this should lead us to question, what is it then about this meeting with God that causes Job to reply, I am comforted. I can move forward with life again. To begin with, it shouldn't escape our attention that this is an encounter with God. Theophanies in the Hebrew Bible are rare. God generally reveals God's self through divine messengers, through the Torah or the words of the prophets, for example. But few individuals actually meet God. Moses and Elijah, for example, do in Moses' encounter with the burning bush at Sinai, and Elijah at Mount Horeb. But these encounters are few and far between, and they're always fraught with mystery and danger. In Job, God meets Job in the form of a whirlwind theophany through which Job is taken on a grand tour of the cosmos. It's noteworthy that God takes notice of this sufferer Job and comes to meet him. In a magnificent and mystifying way, God enters Job's space and invites Job to journey with God, so to speak, in this cosmic vision. Through this, God makes God's self known to Job. An encounter with God is not quite the same as an encounter with another human being. As Moses was told in Exodus 33:20, no one can see God's face and live. But the effects of God's presence were certainly profound upon Job, enough to bring him back into human community again. So in this encounter, God takes Job on a grand journey to the far reaches of the cosmos. He has shown places that no human has ever seen, including the birthplace of the sea, the dwelling place of the light, the storehouses of the snow and the rain, and the realms of the constellations and the stars. Job is then shown a vast display of wild creatures that inhabit this cosmos: lions, ravens, mountain goats, wild donkeys, horses and birds of prey, and the ferocious behemoth and leviathan. These are creatures that, like the vast realms that Job is shown, are beyond the reach of human society and domestication, at least in Job's time. William Brown writes this: what kind of world does God paint for Job's edification? It is certainly no cozy cosmos. It is terrifyingly vast and alien. Far from being barren, creation teems with life characterized by fierce strength, inalienable freedom, and wild beauty. Land, sea, and sky are host to myriad life forms, all alien to human eye and untamable to human hand, but all affirmed and sustained by God. God's world is filled with scavengers and predators, even monsters, all coexisting, though never peacefully. The lions eat their prey, the vultures feast on the slain. This world is God's wild kingdom. So what does this have to do with Job finding comfort? Readers of this text and biblical scholars have debated the meaning of the divine speeches for centuries. and that debate will, I'm sure, continue for years to come. What exactly these speeches are trying to communicate to Job is not readily clear. It's the power of poetry to evoke multiple readings, which the divine speeches do. But I do want to propose one possible reading related to the question of comfort in Job. Earlier in the dialogue, Job speaks disparagingly about some of the creatures and the habitats that God includes in God's tour of the cosmos. Job complains that in his time of suffering, his only companions are the ostrich and the jackal. He says in 30:29, I go about in sunless gloom. I stand up in the assembly and cry for help. I have become a brother to jackals and a companion to ostriches. Earlier in chapter 30, Job laments that he has been cast out from the central realms of society and into the realms where persons live in salt lands and in wadis, those who bray among the nettles and the thorns. He says he lives with those who are driven out from society. In the gullies and wadis they must live, in holes in the ground and in rocks. Among the bushes they bray, and under the nettles they huddle. And in chapter 24, Job even likens the poor of the land to the wild donkeys of the wilderness who go about their toil, scavenging in the wasteland for food for their young. And he uses this image to suggest that God does not take notice of those most in need of justice. Job considers these realms and the inhabitants of these realms to be godless and devoid of life, value, and comfort. It's telling then that God brings Job to these very creatures and these very places that for Job are signs of want, loss, brokenness, chaos, disorder, and suffering. Because in God's purview, these creatures and these places are of the utmost importance. They are not places and creatures that lack value. In fact, God singles them out as those of special concern. And God spends the most time talking about or showing Job the creature that represents chaos to the biblical writers, the Leviathan. God delights in this creature of chaos. Job once complained that he lives among this brood in these hostile places in his suffering. Perhaps God is changing Job's perspective on this state of being, and those who find themselves cast out from the ordered world that they once knew. Suffering is not a place where God is absent or that God does not care about. It does not indicate that God has forgotten about one. No, the wild places and the wild creatures of the cosmos, whom Job now likens himself to, are at the heart of God's care and concern. Job may be acknowledging this in his statement that he is comforted or has changed his stance with respect to dust and ashes in 42:6. The phrase dust and ashes has sometimes been taken literally. Job repents on dust and ashes. But the preposition used here, all, can mean on or about with respect to or concerning as well. And the phrase dust and ashes may be a metaphorical depiction of suffering or even the human condition of frailty and vulnerability in general. It may be that Job is acknowledging that he has found comfort with respect to his own condition of suffering, that he no longer needs the world to be ordered just so. God has shown him a cosmos that is not tameable or controllable by human efforts at all. Perhaps Job recognizes that brokenness and disorder, according to our own standards, are present in the world, but that when we find ourselves in those places, we have good company. And perhaps most importantly, Job may recognize that God is there with him, watching over and caring for him in his brokenness and disorder. Job's search for comfort does not end here, though. His comfort is not quite complete. An encounter with God is life-changing and brings Job out of his state of suffering. But Job cannot stay in this one-of-a-kind experience for too long. Job is a human after all and needs his kin and human friends to complete the picture. So we find Job returned to his human community at the close of the book. And here in the epilogue, the term Naham is used once more. After God reprimands Eliphaz and his companions, the text states that all of Job's brothers and sisters and all of his former friends came to him and had a meal with him in his house. They consoled and comforted him for all of the misfortune that the Lord had brought upon him. Each gave him one casita and each one gold ring. The verb naham here is not put in the infinitive to express purpose as it was in the opening of the book, but it's in what's called a perfect, which shows completed action, as it was in Job's response to God. Again, I should point out that the text here does not read that these friends agreed with Job and therefore he was comforted. Rather, it says they had a meal with Job and then they offered tokens of their friendship, the giving of the coins and rings, perhaps as a gift to help Job back on his feet after losing his possessions. In just these few lines of text, it appears that Job's friends and kin here had a better understanding of what brings comfort than his earlier conversation partners. A demonstration of concrete acts of hospitality and solidarity. These friends and kin entered into Job's space and spent time with him by sharing a meal with him. They engaged in practical behaviors that addressed his concrete physical needs, providing him with gifts that would help him on his feet again. These kinds of actions reveal solidarity, the courage and compassion to get close to another, an acceptance of Job, and the willingness to give him a space and a place in their world, or a show of hospitality. Ellen Davis makes the pointed remark that Job's willingness to have new sons and daughters after the loss of his former children should not be read as a kind of pithy end to this story. Rather, it shows the level of transformation that has occurred in Job. She writes, "In fact, the clearest expression of the renewal of Job's mind is not anything he says. It is his willingness to have more children. I have heard it said in modern Israel that the most courageous act of faith the Jews have ever performed was to have babies after the Holocaust, to trust God with more defenseless children. The note at the end of the book that Job had 7 sons and 3 daughters is often considered to be a cheap parting shot, as though God could make it all up by giving Job another set of children to replace the ones who were lost. But that is to judge the last scene of the book from the wrong side. This book is not about justifying God's actions. It is about Job's transformation. Job's search for comfort in his darkest time of suffering has come full circle. He has sought it from friends who failed to respond appropriately because of their fear of getting dirty or what Job represents. He has found comfort through a new perspective on brokenness and disorder as places where God is present. And he has found comfort through his family and friends through the embodied gifts of solidarity, hospitality, and courageous compassion. I'd like to bring us, excuse me, back to the question of what this means for us today when we live in a world where face to face encounters and sharing in the lives of one another has become much more difficult. If we are to translate the wisdom that Job offers with respect to bringing relief to those who suffer in today's context, we need to think creatively. How can we offer comfort that consists in genuine encounters, solidarity, hospitality, and courageous compassion when we are told to stay safely socially distanced from one another? I hope that we can generate more of a discussion about this, but I will offer a few thoughts just to start things off. First, we may not be called to give an answer to the problem of suffering. We don't always, or maybe I should say we usually don't, have the answers to why persons are experiencing difficulties in life. This is not to say that words, what we say, is irrelevant, but our words cannot be separated from our persons, who we are. Being incarnationally present to another involves an openness to those around us. And it takes a measure of vulnerability, a willingness to face another for whom we might not have answers. So entering into the space of another does not always mean providing the answers for another person. It begins with listening and learning from others, especially those who suffer. Our ability to comfort others involves hearing their stories, giving them a place to speak and lament. And our responses must be formed in true dialogue. Sometimes the best response is silence, not distanced silence, but an engaged silence. And finally, in this time of social distancing, our gifts of hospitality, solidarity, and courage must be shown through creative ways. Perhaps this means bringing meals to someone's doorstep, or hosting a celebratory drive-by when someone returns home from the hospital. Perhaps it means doing someone's grocery shopping for them. This is where we need to think outside the box, but such acts may keep persons connected and strengthened enough to keep moving forward. I'd like to give an example from my own experience, and maybe some of you could do this too when we come to the discussion. I was ill this summer, and I was thinking about what it was that brought me comfort. And it was the response of a few close friends of mine that entailed, I think, three basic things. First, it was having someone take me seriously, letting me narrate my own experience of suffering and not trying to tell me what I was feeling or experiencing. So listening to and acknowledging another's voice of pain is a crucial part of offering comfort. We're not always comfortable with this, I think, especially in some faith traditions. We're taught not to complain and not to burden others, so we don't always know what to do when someone cries out like Job. And this ties back to the question last week about how we incorporate texts like Jesus's cry that God had abandoned him into our own lives of faith. So perhaps it's something we can think about as a community. How do we cultivate a space where the expression of pain is welcomed, taken seriously, and not shunned? Second, it was about the effort. It didn't really matter for me what the details were, whether my friends were bringing food or flowers. I was fortunate enough that all of my basic needs were met, aside from my health. But it was the effort that was made, that another person was willing to change their schedules, make the trip over to my house to make sure that I was okay. That made a difference to me. And finally, it really was about the presence. Even a 6 or 9 foot socially distanced presence was important to me. Seeing that person and having them step into the space of my yard and driveway communicated to me that I was of value to them, and it reminded me of my connectedness to others. And for family and friends who live far away, of course, the phone calls and the texts, the repeated checking in on me those were also comforting. They showed that I was not forgotten. So maybe all of that is to say that we shouldn't get too hung up on the details. We should think creatively, of course, try to find ways to meet others' needs with demonstrations of hospitality and solidarity and wisdom in this environment. But the important thing is that we do continue to reach out. Let me pause a moment and just check to see if anyone has thoughts, questions. I don't see any questions, and I don't see any chat. Let's see. Anyone want to offer suggestions or thoughts, either what we could do in this kind of context where, we are asked to be socially distanced, or any examples from your own life in this socially distanced environment that brought you comfort? I'm not seeing any chat. So I know last week I had a hard time finding the chat. So I'll keep checking back at that. I'm going to keep pressing on, and I want you to keep thinking about that. This really is a struggle for us today in this context, but we're called to continue this kind of relationality with each other. And there are many who have lost economic stability, health, loved ones, and we need to keep these bridges to community open. Okay, I see a chat. So Barbara says, receiving cards and letters were comforting to me when I was very ill several years ago. Yes. And again, it's that concrete expression. This is somewhat, I think, like Job's receiving of the rings and the casita, the gold coins. There's something that expresses value. The another person is taking the time to just let you know that you're not forgotten, and that it's a token of friendship and an expression of their care and concern for you. Thank you. All right, so keep sharing. I'm going to, keep talking, but I do invite you to keep sharing about this theme of comfort. So I want to say a few more things. I've emphasized the giving of comfort throughout these lectures, but I think we can learn a few things about the receiving of comfort as well. I'm going to pause before I jump into this. Keenan says, I agree with what you're saying, putting forth an effort to show you care, no matter the gesture. Yeah. I mean, it was interesting to me. I was thinking about this summer, because I had written this, this presentation, and then I thought, well, what brought comfort to me? And, I was struggling. What are the specific things we can do, in this era of socially distanced, living? And it came down to the effort, and it really wasn't for me so much about whether I was brought homemade bread, I was brought flowers, a card, backyard visits, and it wasn't the details. It was the effort and the token, the presence, just someone coming out of their, like I said, their regular schedules to make that known. Pastor Rosalind Long says, encouraging words from texts or emails, sending items of need through home delivery. Yes. And certainly it's the reaching out. If someone has, specific needs, I do remember at the early stages of my sickness, a friend of mine went grocery shopping for me, and I didn't, she just said, I'm going grocery shopping for you. Sometimes we don't like to say, I need help. She's like, I'm going to bring you over something. And she brought over, things that I needed at that time, healthy soup and orange juice and all the, things that would help me in that specific need. So when we can do that, if we can go grocery shopping for someone and we can fill that need, that's definitely important. Thank you for that. All right, so like I've said, I've been emphasizing the theme of giving comfort. I want to say a few words about receiving comfort. Job's experiences suggest that receiving comfort involves being willing to let others into our space, to share in our experiences. And for some of us, it's not the stepping into others' situations of sufferings that can be frightening, but it's allowing others into our own space, allowing others to share into our own experiences of suffering. We can put up walls for any number of reasons. Maybe we're fearful of confronting head on what it is that we're going through in our own lives. Maybe it's not fear, but a sense of pride. We don't want to admit that we need others. Of course, healthy boundaries are necessary in any relationship, but genuine relationality requires vulnerability and openness on all parties involved. And we can reject comfort if we're fearful of opening our lives to others. Job's experiences also suggest that receiving comfort may require our ability or our willingness to change our perspectives about suffering, about ourselves, or about God and the world. We may begin with expectations that comfort should come to us in a certain form, but we may find ourselves receiving comfort in ways that shatter those expectations. And we see this in Job's encounter with God and his response that his perspective or his posture has changed radically with respect to dust and ashes. The verb naham, as I mentioned, fundamentally means to change one's stance, and we have to look at the context to determine what that changed stance is. When Job declares that he has altered his stance with respect to suffering or the human condition, he is saying something like, I see the world and my own situation completely differently. And that he ends his laments and returns to society and begins a new family demonstrates that changed stance in real concrete behaviors. So comfort may not come in the specific terms that we imagine, and it may change us in profound ways. And finally, receiving the gifts of courageous compassion, solidarity, and hospitality should compel us to extend those gifts to others. We don't see much of Job's story after he returns to the community and is restored in his fortunes, in his friendships and family. But we do have a few details that may show Job's extension of these gifts to others. In chapter 42, 13 through 15, we learn that Job has 7 more sons and 3 more daughters, and we're given the details about the names of Job's daughters. We also read that Job gives them an inheritance along with their brothers. This was not the standard practice in ancient Israel. The inheritance passed to sons alone. The giving of land is a gift of hospitality, a very real demonstration of the gifts of place. And it demonstrates the value that Job has for his daughters, who again in the ancient world would not have been seen as equally as valuable as sons. So it may be that Job has learned through his encounter with God and through the comfort that he received from his friends, that those whom others deem unworthy are the most worthy of courageous compassion, solidarity, and hospitality. You know, we don't know the names of Job's sons, only the daughters' names are preserved. It is those who stand in the margins or the shadows of society, like those creatures whom Job met in God's wild display of the cosmos, who are given a place of special concern here. So the giving of comfort, the receiving of comfort can move us to be givers of comfort to those who need it most, as we see in the close of the book of Job. All right, I'm going to pause. I saw some chats come up, so let me take a look at those. Okay. Yes. Patsy says, my church members have questioned how the second set of children could replace the loss of the first set. But I am now hearing that they did not replace, but were a source of one of the forms of comfort that we need, family. Great observations. And this is something that people wrestle with. And that's why Ellen Davis addressed it, because there's a lot of critique about the end of the book. Oh, everything's great. Job gets new sons and daughters. His wealth is restored. You know, in our own experiences, we can't imagine going back to normal after losing all of our, Lord forbid if anyone has lost all of their children or even one. And I think you're right in that, second aspect of what you say. If we read this not as a sense that it took away the loss of what happened before, but it's a source of comfort. It's a way for Job to say, I can continue to embrace life. I'm never going to make up for the loss of my children. But I don't have to get stuck in this kind of stasis, this static, non-moving. We have all these chapters of dialogue where Job is just, crying out in pain. In time, he's able to move forward in life again. And the second set of sons and daughters, I think, shows that aspect of his journey. Okay. Nathan is going to post that comment for all of the panelists to see. All right. I don't see any more chat messages there. I have just a few minutes. I'm going to briefly summarize what we talked about, and then just say a few more words and close, but please keep posting chats and questions in the next few minutes, and I'll try to get to those. We've discussed the Hebrew Bible's depictions of words and wisdom as embodied realities. And we've moved to the two places in the book of Job where we see that Job has received comfort in the divine speeches and in his return to community, and the show of comfort given to him by his kin and former friends. We talked about what it was about God's response to Job that might have led him to testify that he has found comfort, God's presence, and the changed perspective that Job acquires with respect to places of suffering. And we looked briefly at the response of Job's kin and community as a demonstration of concrete acts of compassion, solidarity, and hospitality. And we also closed with a few remarks about receiving comfort, the openness that requires the transformation of our perspectives and shattering of our expectations sometimes, and the motivation it instills to extend the gift of comfort to others. All right, I put this up last week. I have a few suggestions for further reading. I've added another book on here. As far as the relationship between Job and his friends, what Job expects in his search for comfort, what I've talked about this week comes very much from what I've written in Friendship and Virtue Ethics in the book of Job. You'll find not just a discussion on hesed or solidarity, hospitality, and courage, but several more responses in that book. Ellen Davis has a great chapter on Job in her book, Getting Involved with God, Rediscovering the Old Testament. And I quoted from that in two places in this presentation. You'll find that in that book. She has a wonderful, like I said, chapter on Job. And then if you're interested in Job and the encounter between God and Job, William Brown has written about that in several places. There's an essay in Seeking Wisdom's Depths and Torah's Heights called Job and the Comforting Chaos, where Dr. Brown talks about what it is that can lead Job to say, I am comforted. And he goes into the psychology of awe there, if that's interesting to you. And Dr. Brown also has a chapter on Job in the 7 Pillars of Creation, where he expands more about the divine speeches and how those speeches transform Job's posture with respect to suffering. Okay, I've got some chats I'm going to pick up on. Keenan says, I want to thank you for this. It has truly brought me wisdom and revelation. I was like Job's friends in some ways, and I'm thankful for the understanding this has provided. Thank you, Keenan. I think we're all like Job friends in some ways. Thank you for your honesty. Nathan says, Dr. Vesely, it seems like translation can make some big difference in how we understand the book of Job. Yes. Is there one particular translation that you know of that most adequately represents the meaning of the text as you understand it? Do you have any thoughts about Robert Alter's translation, for example? Um, I would highly recommend Robert Alter's translation. He knows the Hebrew inside and out. And one thing I love about Alter's work is that he tries to convey the physicality that is behind Hebrew concepts. You can't always, you can never do a one-to-one word translation when you're going from one language to another. So there's always a bit of, there's a bit of fluidity in those interpretations. I go back and forth between several translations. Usually when I'm reading, I have my NRSV and my JPS that has the Hebrew there in front of me. And sometimes I don't own Alter's works. That's one that I would love to own, but I don't have a specific answer for you. Maybe the best answer is to compare different translations and where you see differences, especially in a word like Naham. It makes a big difference if Job is saying, I'm guilty, versus Job is saying, I'm comforted. I can now move on with life. So if you see this, a difference in a couple translations that you're reading, maybe that's a sign that, okay, I can look further into this, maybe check out a commentary and do more probing. Great question. All right. I don't see anything that I've missed here. Let me put in a word for Dr. William Brown's presentation that's coming up on this Tuesday. If you're interested in learning more about Job, he'll be speaking on both Genesis and Job in our Ingram lecture series. So it's this Tuesday from 6 to 7 Central Standard Time. And it's free. Anyone can join. Registration is at memphisseminary.edu events. The broad theme of the Ingram lectures this year is environmental ethics and land justice. Dr. Brown is going to be speaking specifically. His title is From the Temple of Life to the Tempest of Life, Genesis and Job in Dialogue as the World Hangs in the Balance. I can say that he's a very engaging speaker, and I'm looking forward to this. I'll be there. So I invite you to check that out, and please join us on Tuesday if you can make that. Also, next week, I invite you to join us for the beginning of our next 2-week Sunday Seminary series, when Dr. Scott Prather will be speaking on faith, doubt, and suffering, some liberation theological lessons for life today. So that should be a great follow-up to this series, and we hope to see you there as well. I see one more. Nathan, I'm just going to read what he says. Thank you all for being with us this morning. We would greatly appreciate your support as we keep Sunday morning seminary going. Donations can be made at any amount, and then www.sundaymorningseminary.org, and we will thank you. Thank you for that, Nathan. All right, once again, I want to thank you all for coming, and I hope that you have a great week. Bye-bye.